joining us for this quick trip over to the eastern part of Washington State. I am Julie O'Donnell, and I'm a member of the Native Plant Appreciation Month Committee, as well as the Central Puget Sound chapter. Thank you for joining us for our last program in exploring topics about prairie preservation. This month, we've recognized partner organizations who share in our work to protect and restore native plant communities throughout the state of Washington. I hope you will continue to visit our website at wnps.org, where you will find chapter activities that take place throughout Washington State. And be sure to read the recent blog featuring Palouse Prairies and photos. The mission of the Washington Native Plant Society is to promote the appreciation and conservation of Washington's native plants and their habitats through study, education, and advocacy. Membership supports native plant conservation and education, and it also connects native plant enthusiasts across the state. To learn about our work, please continue to explore wnps.org/join and consider membership. Your support is appreciated. As a member of the Central Puget Sound chapter, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking from the lands of the Coast Salish people, the original and continuing stewards of the coastlines and lands of the Salish Sea. Before our speaker begins, I would like to encourage you to visit the South Sound Prairies on Prairie Appreciation Day on May 11th. To learn more, go to prairieappreciationday.org, and I believe Elena is going to put that in the chat for us. Tonight, we ask you to leave comments in the chat box and questions in Q&A. They will be answered at the end of the program. Thank you. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Becky Brown. Dr. Brown is an ecology professor at Eastern Washington University, where she has taught since 2004. She studies plant ecology in a range of ecosystems, including riparian zones, inland northwest prairies, and the channeled scablands. Recent projects include prairie restoration at the Eastern Washington University campus, riparian restoration after dam removal on the Elwha River on the Olympic Peninsula, invasive annual grass distribution and management, and assessing the role beavers play in mitigating wildfire effects in Eastern Washington. Becky has a PhD in ecology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And now we'll turn the screen over to Becky Brown. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm really excited to share with you about some of our work. Okay, so can you see my screen properly?
Looks
Julie?
good. Yes.
Okay, good. So I'll be telling you about our work restoring and preserving Palouse Prairie plant communities. And I do want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional homelands of the Spokane tribe of Indians. And they actually played a role in the Palouse Prairie, but we can talk about that soon. So one of the impetus for this talk is that I'm gonna let me fix something really quick because it for some reason decided not to scroll. So we'll try to get that. Okay. Well, we had it working, Julie, didn't we?
You know, mine does that sometimes, and I try different arrows. Sometimes it's just tapping the little mouse pad on the laptop will do it too. So
Okay, I got it now. All right, keeping going. So the impetus for this talk today is that less than 0.5% of native Palouse Prairie is left. And in fact, some literature says that it's less than 0.1%. And that's because much of it's been converted to agriculture. And as you can see in this picture, in my talk today, it is still not scrolling. I'm so sorry. Okay, I think I've got it down now. In my talk today, I'm going to be describing the Palouse Prairie and talking about how it differs from some similar but adjacent habitat, the channeled scablands, and some of the notable species. And then we'll talk about why and how to restore Palouse Prairie, including ecosystem functions, some ongoing efforts, and what we've learned and still need to know. So the Palouse Prairie ecoregion is shown here in purple. You can see this purple part of this map that says Palouse grasslands. And it's a grassland that gets about 30 to 60 centimeters of precipitation a year, depending on where it's found. And it consists of rolling hills of deep loess soil that was basically has been here for around 100,000 years or more since glacial retreat left a huge amount of loess that then got blown into these dunes. And the plant communities are largely bunch grasses and forbs with some shrubs like snowberry interspersed. So one thing you'll notice is that the Palouse grassland is slightly separated from some of the other grasslands in the United States, like shortgrass prairie and tallgrass prairie. And it differs because it has bunch grasses where those do not. So that's something that's unique. This map also shows a pretty broad definition of Palouse grasslands. It goes all the way from Zumwalt Prairie in Oregon up to Okanagan County. And there are some folks have a narrower view of it as just in the area around Pullman, Washington. So starting around the turn of the century, or before the turn of the century, the Palouse was tilled for agriculture, and there was extensive farming done. So they tilled up the prairie soils and converted it into largely wheat production. Wheat is one of the third largest crops in Washington, and it brings in over $1 billion in a given year. It's a very important economic driver for Washington State in Washington. But the agricultural conversion meant that the existing prairie vegetation has been largely lost. And this is a diagram from an article by Ann Black et al. in 1998. And you can see that this brown area, which is the Palouse, is the existing vegetation that's largely cropland. And it used to historically be bunchgrass communities, fescue and bunchgrass. And you can see that very little is left. And in fact, if you look at the percent of the county and farms between 1890 and 1992, you can see that, say in Whitman County, for example, it's almost 100% farms by 1992. And in fact, most of that conversion occurred by 1930. So it's been in this tilled state for a very long time, which means that in the areas that have been converted, there's really no seed bank. The soils have been altered. Everything's different now. So one of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit is how is the Palouse Prairie different from the nearby channeled scablands? And this is a map I just pulled up from Google Earth. You can do this too. And it shows, you can see Spokane, and you can see the region of the Palouse Prairie that's a light green, kind of spreading up from Pullman and, extending all the way up to Cheney and beyond. And then you see these dark brown channels that are the flood channels created by the Missoula floods. And so those dissected the Palouse Prairie remnants, especially the ones that are just south of Spokane. You can see that here. This is a circle that's around Cheney, Washington. And if you kind of zoom in here, you can see Cheney, and you can see that Cheney is basically an island of Palouse. So you can see the fields and the rolling hills right here in this little island. And then you can see some other islands, like there's a little island near Medical Lake. And then you can see this kind of bigger island dissected by Hangman Creek and its tributaries near Spangle. And then just south of Cheney is Turnbull National Wildlife Refuge. And that is largely channeled scablands created by the Missoula floods. And so you're seeing these Missoula flood channels kind of dissecting these islands of loess soil. So the channeled scablands are important to bring up, and they're relevant to this discussion because they're in some ways more intact than the Palouse because they were not tilled, they could not be tilled. They've been heavily grazed, but because they weren't tilled, and they tend to have a much more diverse flora left. And so some of this is now, being seen as potential seed sourcing for Palouse Prairie remnants. And so a question that I've had, and some of my students have had is it really different? Are these different plants? Are the plants adapted differently? What's going on? What's different about channeled scablands? So channeled scablands, because the flood washed away all the loess soils, it has shallow soil over basalt bedrock rock with some pockets of deeper soils. There's a lot of potholes and pools, vernal pools, and small wetlands. It has mimo mounds or mimo mounds. We call them mimo mounds here in Eastern Washington, which is apparently incorrect, but so mimo mounds. And so, and there are these, you can see these mounds of soil that are about 1 meter tall and maybe 5 to 10 meters wide. And they have, they actually have prairie plant communities on them. And you can see that in the foreground here, where you've got a mimo mound with lots of lupine and yarrow and blanket flower and other, prairie plants. This is out at Turnbull National Wildlife Refuge. And so channeled scablands also have a climate gradient from east to west. So Hanford Reach is technically channeled scablands, but it's sagebrush steppe. Whereas over to the more east, Turnbull National Wildlife Refuge, the climate is much wetter. It's at least twice the amount of rainfall, and has a more Palouse, the climate overlaps with the Palouse. And they were used for grazing. So you can see these areas that are brown in this picture. Those are where it's really shallow soil. It's only maybe 5 centimeters deep. And as a consequence, this dries out much earlier in the spring. And, it's a very drought, arid type environment with plants adapted accordingly. Just to give you some examples of channeled scabland remnants, if you wanted to visit, that have similar climate to Palouse Prairie. Well, first, Turnbull National Wildlife Refuge. There's Fish Trap Recreation Area, which is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Hole in the Ground, which is just south of the refuge. Palisades City Park in Spokane is an excellent example of channeled scabland habitat. Palouse Falls. There's Telford Recreation Area, which is near Davenport, and then Swanson Lakes Wildlife Area. So there's a lot of different examples. In contrast, the Palouse Prairie environment has these deep loess soil dunes that could potentially be hundreds of meters, maybe not hundreds, but, tens of meters deep. And so, and it's been, because it has this deep soil, it's been cultivated, largely tilled. You can see that in the background of this picture, which was taken from Steptoe Butte. And what's left tends to be on areas that are too steep or rocky to till. Like here at Steptoe, in some ways, I wonder if, this is probably going to be in some ways more similar to channeled scablands anyway, because it's on these steep rocky areas. And is there anything left of the Palouse that was at lower, flatter elevations? That's a open-ended question. And how did those differ? So examples of Palouse Prairie remnants include Steptoe Butte, Kamiak Butte County Park, Calotis Ridgetop, Rose Creek Nature Preserve, Hudson Biological Preserve, McCroskey State Park, and those are all kind of around the area of Moscow and Pullman. And then further to the north here in Spokane, there's Palouse remnants that are in private land holdings, some of which are conserved and some of which are not, do not have any kind of protection on them. And so, but I mean, one thing I want to emphasize is these remnants are extremely rare and they're really treasures. There's, you know, the only place where you can find the original Palouse plant communities, soil communities, microbiome, you know, everything is still there. And so they're extremely precious places. So one of my students, Eric Peterson, he did his master's thesis looking at Palouse Prairie remnants and comparing it to channeled scablands to see how they differ in terms of plant species composition. And this is an ordination diagram. And to understand it, you just need to know that these red dots and blue triangles are vegetation plots where he documented the plant community. And if the dots are really close together, it means the community is really similar. And if they're far apart, the community is really different. And so you can see that there's overlap between the Palouse in blue and the channeled scablands in red, but there's also some significant differences and in species composition. And so, for example, the scablands tend to have more annual species, including more, you know, higher abundance of invasive annual grasses, things like ventinata or cheatgrass or Japanese brome, Bromus comitatus, things like that. And then it also will have species that are somewhat more adapted to arid conditions that'll overlap more with sagebrush steppe because of those really shallow soils and rocky areas. I mean, and then there's other parts of the channeled scablands that are full on ponderosa pine forest. So it's quite a mix. Whereas Palouse is a little bit more uniform, but it has its own, you know, variations. Some examples of plant species that are found more consistently in channeled scablands versus Palouse, and I'm going to say they all overlap. You can find all of these species in both, but if you look at the community, the dominant species, you know, that are common are going to be in these different groups. So channeled will have more parsnip flower buckwheat or Eriogonum, Heracleoides, hairleaf, Lagophylla ramosissima, which we didn't find at all in Palouse Prairie. We found it a decent amount in channeled scabland habitat. Tarweeds, Mattia exigua is one of them, which are these little annual plants that grow in the shallow soil areas. Poa bulbosa is very happy in the shallow soil areas, so bulbous bluegrass, and it's a non-native species. And bird vetch we tend to see on the Mima mounds, where it's pretty dominant. And it's not dominant in Palouse Prairie habitat, so it's possible that this is because of planting for grazers for cattle. And so on the Palouse, we tend to see communities more dominated by perennial plants like balsam root, sticky geranium, prairie smoke, hairy Albert, fernleaf biscuit root. Fernleaf biscuit root we only see in the southern Palouse. It gets up to about Steptoe, and there's some a little bit here and there further north, but it's not a dominant like it is, say on Steptoe Butte. Blue bunch wheatgrass and Symphoricarpus albus are both also really common as abundant species in these communities. And there's less non-native species, but I will say the non-native invasive annual grasses are there. I was just out at Steptoe Butte and found Medusa head wild rye, which I was very sad to see. It's around. So here's some pictures of these species. Here's parsnip flower buckwheat and common hairleaf from the channeled scablands. And then here's a community that's dominated by blue bunch wheatgrass and balsam root. And you can also see like these little tiny yellow things sticking up into the blue sky. Those are the flowers from fernleaf, biscuit root, Lomatium dissectum. And so that's kind of it's abundant in that community. Here's another picture on the left of fernleaf biscuit root. And that's at Steptoe Butte. Sticky geranium and hairy Albert, one of my favorite plants with all its fuzz. So it's a very fuzzy species. And you go there, you go to Steptoe Butte, and when this is mature, kind of in the late summer, and you see, just the light shining through all these fuzzy plants. It's very beautiful. The Palouse also has some unique, rare, and endemic species that are most abundant here and not as abundant in other areas. Although, spalding silene, for example, you can find in some of the canyon grasslands and other grasslands in Montana. So these are classified as by the Nature Serve and by the Natural Heritage Program as either rare at the global or state level, indicated by G or S. If they have a 1, it means they're critically imperiled, 2 is imperiled, and 3 is vulnerable. And so all of these are going to be either, they're mostly globally imperiled or vulnerable, and at the state level, they're considered to be critically imperiled or imperiled. So spalding silene is one of them, Spalding's catchfly. That is federally listed plant species. It only grows, it's one of those species that doesn't grow in dense abundances where it's found. And so even, it may have been not terribly common even when the Palouse was more intact. There's Palouse thistle on the top right there. And bottom left, we have broadfruit mariposa, Calochortus nitidis. There's a Palouse goldenweed, Pyracoma liatriformis, Astragalus erectus, and or Palouse milkvetch, and then Aster jessicae, Jessica's aster. So if you ever go to these sites, you need to keep a sharp eye out for some of these. They have some subtle differences from the more common species in the genre. So pollinators are also a significant part of Palouse habitats, as they are everywhere, but they're significant in their diversity. So pollinators are dependent on forbs, and forbs are, your wildflower species that are not grasses and not woody, right? And so they, at least in the Palouse, the forbs are really important for them. And Hatton et al. In 2013 publication documented 10 bumblebee species as compared to 15 that were recorded historically. So it looks like a significant number were not found. And Rhodes et al. In 2017 had a publication documenting 210 wild bee species. And that makes the Palouse a hotspot of wild bee diversity. In their publication, they showed the diversity of bees in different grasslands. And in the Midwest, tallgrass prairies, it's about 70 species. The only other place that had more species was Zumwalt Prairie, which some consider Palouse. So, so it's as you can see, this region has a lot of wild bee species, which are important pollinators. Bees and wasps formed the majority of plant pollinator interactions documented by Emma Hoskins et al. And she did that as part of her master's thesis. So some of Emma's work was looking at plant pollinator interactions and plant pollinator networks. She did network analysis and used that to rank which species of plants were most important for plant pollinator networks, meaning that they, if they were lost, some extinctions might occur of some of the pollinators, for example, potentially. And she has quite a long list, so I'm just listing a few of them, like the top few here. And right at the top of the list in rank 1 is mountain yampa, or Paradiridia montana. And what's interesting about that is that's also a culturally significant species to the Spokane tribe that used to, it's one of the root species that they would eat, but it's considered a very important species. And if you look at commercial seed availability of the species and the amount that's used in restoration right now, it's like not much, right? Zero or very little. If it's used, I haven't heard of it. I mean, you can't find it at commercial seed growers. And so I think there's kind of a gap there, because this is a plant that's very important, and we're not putting it back, into these mixes. Other important species are Potentilla gracilis, or slender cinquefoil, which is really easily mixed up with our invasive Potentilla recta, or sulfur cinquefoil, which has become quite a problem in our region. There's Epilobium brachycarpum, willow herb, and this is a really common weed that if you live in Eastern Washington, you probably have it like on your driveway. But it's actually pretty important for pollinators. And I'll say this is one of the few species that seems to pop up on its own in agricultural fields that's native. You have Acalea millefolium, or yarrow, and that's widely available commercially and grows pretty easily to buckwheat, Periogonum heracleoides, and then Geranium viscosissimum, sticky geranium. And that has, even though it's a beautiful plant, has very limited availability, and what's available is very expensive. The last I checked, it was like something like $600 a pound for the seed. And so, most people can't afford to seed that broadly across a big project. Okay, so that's my overview of what is the Palouse Prairie and what are some of the important species. The next question is why and how to restore the Palouse. And so let's get on with it. So why do we want to restore this? Well, I think I'm speaking to the choir with this crowd when I say, look at it. It's gorgeous. So it's a beautiful habitat. It's full of diversity. I can see many species in that single photo. And so to me, it's just, why I ask the question. But nevertheless, there's others that have more pragmatic views of things. And so the Palouse also provides a number of important ecosystem functions, not least of which is biodiversity, because it has a number of rare endemic species and unique communities. It adds to global biodiversity. It adds to the biodiversity of wild bees for sure. And that's just a start. We haven't even documented that microbiome very completely. It's important for carbon sequestration. Prairie soils sequester, when they're intact, and sequester a lot of carbon in the plant roots, which go very deeply. They can go down 1 meter or even 2 meters into the soil and grow in thick mats. And they also are really important for water quality, because an intact prairie, when the prairies of the Palouse were intact, the water quality in the region ran clear. There were clear streams, and there wasn't a lot of suspended sediments in them. And these functions were all damaged when the prairies were tilled. And you can see, here's a picture from Wikimedia Commons that just shows Palouse, very typical site where basically after a rainstorm, you get these huge erosion granules and lots of topsoils going down into the streams and rivers. So topsoil loss has been a huge problem in the Palouse. There's been an average loss of about a 1/2 inch per decade. Across the Palouse, that's a huge volume when you start adding it up, and 4 times that on steep slopes, according to an article by Pimentel et al. Over 40% of Palouse topsoil has been lost. So, and some people say half. Recently I read an article that said half has been lost. And this has consequences, one is reduced crop yields. Without this fertile part of the soil, crop yields go down. I can say it, the fields that I'm familiar with, the soil is no longer a dark brown organic rich color. It's a light brown and has very little organic matter in it. It's mostly clay and sand, and a little bit of silt. So this creates high runoff and very turbid rivers. And this picture on the bottom right is kind of a famous photo that was published in the Inlander that shows a few years ago Hangman Creek running into the Spokane River, carrying a lot of Palouse sediment. So restoring biodiversity has been shown to increase carbon sequestration. And this is a study by Yang et al. In 2019, published in Nature Communications. What's interesting here is the more species that were restored, the greater the carbon storage rate and the greater the carbon concentration. So, the x-axis of this left figure has number of species, and then soil carbon storage. Blue is years 13 to 22, and the gray is years 1 to 13. And you can see that it just keeps going up. So with few species, the carbon storage is relatively low. And we see that also in the figure on the right, which is showing soil carbon concentration increasing with more species. So diversity has its roles. And so how do we bring it back? There have been some broad-scale prairie reconstruction efforts that have taken place. And probably the one that's impacted the most acreage is the CRP SAFE initiative. It's called the Palouse Prairie SAFE initiative in the state of Washington. It's administered by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to plant native species on CRP land. And CRP stands for the USDA's Conservation Reserve Program. And they basically provide funds for farmers to put some of their land into plants that are good for wildlife. And so an example of that is on the bottom left. And a big challenge in this program has been low forb diversity. Typically, the seed mixes for this are 80% bunch grasses, 20% forbs, and they'll have like maybe 6 species total. And, in this one site here, which Kurt Merg brought us to, you can see there's just no forbs. It's all grasses. And so that's probably not going to do a lot for your pollinators. And if without your pollinators, it affects your birds, it affects, the entire food web. That said, this program is a huge improvement over past CRP, which basically you can see an example of that here with the pine trees and the grass. They planted Siberian wheatgrass and non-native species, 1 species, and dotted a few pines across it and called it good. And so that has, not very many native species in it. So Emma Hoskins looked at whether reconstructed prairie sites through the CRP SAFE program had similar levels of forb and pollinator species richness to remnant prairie sites. And as you can see, so here's a figure where the x-axis is month, 2 figures. So we've got from June to September. And the y-axis on the left is forb species richness. On the right is pollinator taxa richness. Red is the reconstructed, blue is the remnant. And it's pretty easy to see that the remnants have a lot more forb species, especially in June and July. It seems to decline by September. And then the pollinator taxa richness is also a lot higher. And I didn't include all the figures she has in her thesis, but she also showed that the plant-pollinator interactions were also much greater in the number of interactions was greater in the remnants. In the reconstructed prairies, non-native species were actually playing a pretty important role for pollinators. So that was kind of interesting. So how do we restore forb biodiversity, right? So we've got this problem where a lot of the restorations, they get the bunch grasses back. And native prairie, a lot of the sites for native prairie, you hardly see any bunch grass. I mean, they're there, but you see a lot of forbs. And so that's kind of an open-ended question. One potential solution would be to increase the proportion of forbs in these mixes, but because the forbs are much more expensive and in some ways less reliable than these grasses that have been cultivated and used, a lot of farmers aren't going to be willing to take a risk doing that and not having a successful CRP where they can get their funds. And so it's an interesting question. So another aspect of this is how do we restore ecosystem function, right? So obviously, if we restore forb biodiversity, we can restore pollinators a lot better than if we're just doing grasses alone. So that's a component of ecosystem function. And what species and functions should we prioritize, right? Should we prioritize pollination, wildlife forage, forage for things like sharp-tailed grass, which is common in the Palouse region. Invasive weeds, should we make sure the species are competitive against invasive weeds? And that's one of the reasons the bunch grasses get picked, because once they do get in a dense stand, it's very hard for weeds to invade. Erosion, also something grasses are very good at controlling. What actually gets prioritized typically is cost. Invasive weeds often play a role. I mean, we're in an agricultural setting. People do not want weeds for lots of reasons. And then there's also practicalities like seed availability. What seed can you get your hands on? When? Where? Is it genetically local? Sometimes that doesn't even become a consideration. So something that needs to be done is to optimize these restoration seed mixes to increase biodiversity, prevent erosion. There's questions like related to tribal food sovereignty, for example, incorporating species that are important for food sovereignty, species that support pollinator networks and wildlife that sequester carbon, and of course, last but not least, they're cost-effective and help with the weed management problem. Because if weeds take over your restoration site, non-native species, then it's not, quite serving the same purpose from a biodiversity standpoint. So just one example of thinking about how ecosystem function can play a role is looking at plant pollinator networks. And so this is from Emma Hoskins' work, but, and there's a big literature out there around plant pollinator networks, but different species of plants and pollinators have different roles, and some are more important than others, right? Some are more keystone species that if you take away that species, that you might see much more instability in the network. So module hubs, for example, are species that have high connectivity within modules. So they connect with a lot of different other species and have a lot of interactions within the kind of a grouping of plants and pollinators that seem to interact together. So you have these different modules of these different groupings. Connectors connect modules, different modules, but at kind of a small scale. While network hubs are species that have high connectivity within and between modules. And then you have peripherals, which have relatively few connections within modules. They're kind of the more specialized things, but sometimes highly endangered, right? So things that, only pollinate one plant and that plant depends on that particular pollinator. But, from an ecosystem function standpoint, these hubs and connectors are probably going to be something you want to focus on if you want to bring back your pollinators. So going back to our list of important plant species, right? These first 5 species are all module hubs based on Emma's work in remnant prairies and in reconstructed prairies. And sticky geranium is actually the only species that she documented that was a network hub. So it's also, even though it's ranked 8, I think it's very important. It's the only network hub species. And again, go back to your commercial seed availability. Obviously, it's not been based on this, right? And some of this information is relatively new, but so there's no mountain yampa, no willow herb. We'll talk about that more later. Very limited sticky geranium. A little bit more of some of these other things, but and this is just the first 6 species on the list. She's got a longer list than this, and other species that play important roles are also missing from this list, or missing from this commercial seed supply. So another question one might ask is a higher or lower diversity seed mix better for restoration? With high diversity, we saw the results, the effects on sequestration in the Midwest. It remains to be seen whether that's also true in the Palouse Prairie ecoregion. But with high diversity, you can have bet hedging, where there's a higher odds of having a plant species or a few plant species that'll be successful, even if your conditions are weird that year, or your site is weird or whatever. You can have more functional groups of plants, so things like nitrogen fixers and annuals and different, pollinator groups. You can have, but high diversity tends to be really expensive, especially at larger scales. Low diversity has an advantage in that if you're seeding at a consistent seeding rate, which usually if you're going out to seed drill, you seed at a rate something like 80 seeds per square foot or something like that. If you hand broadcast, you have also an equivalent, but slightly higher seeding rate. If you have fewer species in the mix, then there's more seeds of that species per square foot, right? So if you have 20, species in your mix, and it's 80 seeds per square foot, then that's only 4 seeds per species in that each, square foot, which honestly is not very high. And so the low diversity mixes sometimes have an advantage, because if you have a species that's a winner, there's going to be more of it, right? And they're also more cost friendly. Both of these rely on having locally sourced propagules, though. So, and the ability to get genetically appropriate local seed, which is not always possible. And that's been a major limiting factor for our project here at Eastern. There's also a missing functional group in many seed mixes for prairies, which is the annuals, and especially in the Palouse Prairie ecoregion. Annuals are plants that live only 1 year. They're rapid colonizers and early successional species, so they can quickly establish and get going, which is pretty different than perennials like bunch grasses, which take 3 to 5 years, and balsam root, which probably takes 5 to 10 years to get established. You have similar life history to many of the invasive species, especially invasive annual grasses, so it's potentially something that could compete against them. But they're not available. You cannot get annual seed in Eastern Washington, except for maybe Clarkia pulchella, which is ragged robin, or Elkhorn clarkia. It's a beautiful plant, but it's only one, right? So, that's not the only missing functional group from commercially available seed. Species that reproduce vegetatively or from corms are often missing. Some of the early spring species are often missing, things like, maybe even buttercup. It's hard to find seed for species like that. So here's a diagram from Christy Snyder that shows the role of annuals in prairie succession, or kind of a hypothesized role. So if you have your tilled soil that has 0 seed bank, or maybe just weeds, right? Invasive annual weeds. If you can get some early successional annual species, then at least in your early thing, they might compete with the weeds, or at least they'll add native diversity, right? And then, over time, you develop into your climax plant community, prairie plant community of later successional perennial species. But, what the role is here of annuals is really unclear. In natural successional processes, they play a critical role. When we're doing prairie restoration, or restoration at all, sometimes we're trying to jumpstart things and skip to the climax community. And it's possible that these early successional species are doing things that we need. Here's some examples of annual species that are common in the Palouse. So Colomia linearis, Colomia grandiflora. If you're from Western Washington, you should be familiar with that one. That's around. The Epilobium brachycarpum, really common. Madia exigua, Madia glomerata, Plantago patagonica, and Polygonum majus. So this Plantago is a beautiful plant, a really fuzzy little thing that, grows in dense amounts in, little mima mounds and shallow soil areas and channeled scablands. So another aspect of prairie restoration is soil restoration. You need to have your soils to have a functional ecosystem. And tilling and topsoil erosion has led to heavily degraded soils. And so some approaches are looking at soil amendments like biochar or other kinds of mulch. And biochar is kind of interesting. It's pyrrolized litter. It adds organic matter to the soil. And it's been shown in agricultural settings to increase microbial abundance, moderate pH, increase water retention and soil porosity. So it's possible that where you have as degraded soils as we have in the Palouse, adding something like this or some other soil amendment could help accelerate restoration of the soil and then thereby the whole ecosystem. So here you can see your tilled soils, lots of clay, little organic matter, and then over time you get this accumulation of organic matter and microorganisms that sequesters carbon and actually is one of the reasons prairies play a role in the global carbon cycle. It can help mitigate climate change. Another thing that affects restoration is going to be your environmental variation within a site, right? And so in the Palouse, we have this rolling topography where you have different aspects, right? North, south, east, west. And you have ridge tops and swales. The ridge tops have been most eroded. The swales are where some of that soil is accumulated. So you have some differences. And those are going to affect the outcomes. Up top, you can see step-toe butte. And again, something you can observe both in these prairies and in sagebrush steppe is often those south and west facing slopes have a lot of invasive weeds like cheatgrass, and the north and east facing slopes are all nice and native plants. And it's not totally clear why that is, but you get big differences and that are likely to affect your restoration. Yet, a lot of time, with CRP, they basically put the seed mix into the drill and they drill the whole site without necessarily considering that variation. We certainly do that with wheat. So that brings me to, the restoration work we're doing here at Eastern Washington University. And I do want to note there's other other restoration projects going on with, for example, Latah County Conservation District, and the Palouse Prairie Foundation does work with restoration. So it's not, WSU does work. So this is one project, but I think a lot more is needed. And so EWU has set aside 120 acres of land that the campus owns that had formerly been used for wheat production. And it was basically leased out to a farmer at negligible profit to the university. And so as part of climate mitigation and the need to sequester carbon, the idea is to convert this back to native prairie and kind of sequester carbon, bring back biodiversity, and also, it'll be a place for recreation. There'll be trails in there where students can meander from campus and, take a walk in nature. I kind of like this photo. I don't know if you can see it, but in the far back, you got Stub-Toe Butte in the distance. You see this little mound in kind of the center right. And then in the medium back, you can see Turnbull National Wildlife Refuge in the channeled scablands, because remember, Cheney is kind of an island of Palouse soil, loess soil in the midst of all that Missoula floods. And so the goal of this restoration is to establish a prairie restoration research center that can help inspire and enhance regional restoration and conservation. And Eastern having somewhere around 10,000 students that are going to be exposed to this and walk across this and see the educational signage and do research on this. I think it'll be a great way to help increase broad awareness about plant conservation and prairie restoration. So I'm pretty excited about it. That said, it's been a long process. We've been talking about this for 5 years now. What have we done? We have done a 15-acre pilot site, right? And so we're actually going to be seeding the rest of the prairie in the fall with a grass-only seed mix based on some of the lessons we learned from this pilot site, which I'll get to. But the pilot site is this dark brown area. This is actually it being tilled or being drill seeded with native species. And, it's done with experimental seed mixes to kind of see what works best. I'll kind of skip to the close, but we found that invasive species were just so dominant in the seed bank and the soil that, especially in the swales, they really dominated the show, which is why we're going with the sort of CRP approach of doing grass-only seed mix so that we can use herbicide, broadleaf herbicide, to control some of that. Because we've got to get the site, we've got to get that knocked back a little bit to get native species time to establish. So we did these seed mix experiments to kind of look at what is the optimal mix. We would have liked to have done even more than we did, I must say, but we did 2 experiments. One was a hand broadcast experiment, and the truth is this was done because that year it was too wet to seed drill, but by the time we had everything ready to go. So we did the hand broadcast of seed into the snow in this design, and then a year later we did the drill seeding and seeded in different seed mixes. We looked at the effects of seed mix diversity, number of species, biochar, functional groups, and topography. And so, this is complicated. We don't have to spend a lot of time here, but this is the hand broadcast experiment layout. And so it was set up on different topographic areas, like the east-facing bottoms, tops. And it had, the lighter colors are the low diversity perennial seed mix. The darker colors, the high diversity perennial seed mix. The dots are where annual seeds were added. And then the stripes are where biochar was added. And this was done, in a fully crossed experiment by Christy Snyder, graduate student. And then the seed drill experiment had the same seed mixes for high and low forb diversity, and they're shown here. So the seed mix included grass only, low diversity, and 30% forbs, 70% grass. Low diversity, 40% forbs, 60% grass, and high diversity with just the typical 30% forbs and 70% grass. And the high diversity was 14 species, so it's not terribly high. And then over top of those strips, you can see these cross strips of biochar that was added in different treatments in 4 different places. So the results basically showed that in both experiments, topography overwhelmed other factors. So, and this is just the first year, so bear that in mind. And this is based on Thurman Johnson's master's thesis that he defended in 2023. And you can see that, top south, for example, had the highest native cover and the lowest non-native cover. The 3 different topographic zones are on the x-axis, and the y-axis are things like native and non-native cover. On the bottom is native richness and non-native richness. And interestingly, the top south had the highest native richness, and also the higher non-native richness. And it's probably because of this cover factor, right? In the bottoms, and I'll show you some pictures. In the bottoms, we had really high cover of non-native species, and they kind of reduce diversity of everything. And this was first year, but so top south looks something like this. On the left, you can see that light brown soil without organic matter. It's, it had more native diversity. And then here's north facing, which kind of a middle ground. And then in these swales or the bottoms, it was so dominated by this one particular weed, Anthemis cotula, which is also called dog fennel. It's a common agricultural weed, not even that common in non-agricultural settings, but it dominated and took over irrespective of the seed mix. And then it created this huge mat that just collapsed and dried out in the fall. And I don't think native plants could get through that. So it sort of is something that needed to be watched for. There was also some weather factors, and we'll get to that in a minute. It was a very wet year, and so that may have driven part of that. Annual seed addition was effective at increasing native species richness in swale and southwest sites, and these effects persisted into the second year of sampling. It didn't have a huge effect on non-native species, but it did allow natives to be part of the species composition. And you can see pictures of that here. Here's a low diversity plot, low diversity perennial species seed mix with no annuals added. And on the right is a low diversity perennial seed mix with annuals added to it. This total overall density per square foot of seeds was kept the same across those. And you can see that there's a lot of native plants on this one on the right. So it's looking pretty good.
Hey, Becky.
Yeah.
People are saying that the slides are not changing, so we're still on the chart slide. I don't know.
Sorry.
Yeah, there we go.
Oh dear. Okay. Darn. Sorry about that. There was advancing on mine again. Okay, so here's the picture that shows the dominance by invasive weeds on the right in the swales and the non-dominance in the, drier top south conditions. And then here we are looking at the effects of annual seed addition, where basically annuals increase native species richness, which is in the green, in the sites that had low diversity perennial mix. And then here's a picture that is documenting or showing what that looks like. So you have a lot more species on the right. Thank you for the heads up. I would not have wanted to proceed the whole talk like that. So you can see a lot more species. You can see that Plantago patagonica is one of the species that Christy used in that. Biochar increased native species richness on south and west facing sites, which were the hotter, drier type, more exposed sites in hand broadcast experiment in the first year, but not the seed drill experiment. And so again, on the x-axis of this figure, we've got swale, north, southwest, top east. And on the y-axis, we've got log native species richness with and without biochar. Biochar is in red. And you can see it didn't have much effect except for this southwest site. We also found a different study found it increased the diversity of soil fauna, like nematodes, to have this. The reason that we didn't see it in the seed drill experiment, but we did see it in the hand broadcast experiment, I think has to do with interannual variation in rainfall. So I'm just overlaying this graph on here. It shows the months on the x-axis. We've got in red 2021, blue 2022, and black is the 8-year average of the amount of rain. And you can see that in 2021, which was the hand broadcast experiment, it was exceedingly low rainfall compared to normal, right? We had a very, very dry spring. And then in 2022, it was more normal until June, when it was 3 or 4 times the amount of rainfall as normal, and that's a big time for a lot of plant growth, especially Anthemis cotula. And so the dog fennel. And so I think that probably drove some of those results more than, what seed mix we used. which just shows all these side factors that come in when you're doing restoration. So, to summarize, what have we learned? So we learned that topography, or more broadly speaking, variations in underlying environment have a strong effect on restoration outcomes. Even in sites that have been plowed and used as wheat fields for, with the same species growing in it for 80 years, right? And same species across all those topographic areas. We learned that interannual variation in weather affects outcomes, right? Or at least we strongly suspect that. But there's been a number of other studies that have shown that to be the case. We know and learned further, and we're reinforced the fact that restoration takes time. So the outcomes we're looking at are just first and second year. The problem is we're jumping forward with them, because we need to move forward with our restoration, and we only have first and second year outcomes to lean on. But, at least we'll be able to have some abilities to, make good decisions about the first and second year of the larger restoration. Seed mix diversity didn't increase plant diversity at first, but it did have effects after 2 years. I didn't show that that figure, but it did start to increase diversity to have a higher diversity perennial seed mix, but it took time to manifest. Annual seed addition can improve restoration outcomes by increasing species diversity, native diversity. Biochar had really complex effects, but when it's a dry year and in a dry site, it seemed to be beneficial for the native plants, but it can also help weeds. Let's keep that in mind. And overall, the effects of our seeding treatments on non-natives were pretty negligible in the first year. And so, I think the jury's still out on whether you can, in the first year or two, get enough seed in to compete with your non-natives. But over time, as the perennials become more established, like the bunch grasses, one would expect that they would outcompete some of those early successional non-native weeds. So this project's just at the beginning. Restoration of prairies takes decades. And so we're kind of really looking forward to following this. And it's nice that it's in a location where you have students that can do research and faculty that are, going to follow it, which is a lot different from a lot of other restoration projects. And a lot of sites, the long-term monitoring is pretty limited. So what's needed? Well, I think primarily what we need is seed development. There's a national seed strategy that BLM and Forest Service have developed for developing native seed availability. But overall, especially in the Palouse, we need more diverse commercially available seed. And it needs to be more diverse both in terms of genetics, because we have such a gradient in rainfall cover over a short area in Eastern Washington. It needs to be diverse in terms of species, and we need species that meet conservation priorities, like important for pollinators. We need to have more innovative restoration approaches. For example, instead of seed drilling the same mix across a site in the Palouse, tailoring it a little bit more to the topographic setting. We need long-term monitoring and adaptive management so we can learn by doing. A lot of sites, especially in CRP, it's pretty minimal monitoring, and then the adaptive management part doesn't necessarily happen, meaning, change what you're doing to make it, try to improve things. We need to think about climate adaptability. There's this tool called the Climate Smart Restoration Tool, which allows you to pick where to collect seed to put in a given site to see if the climate will be similar. And if you look at certain climate variables for the Palouse, in about 50 years, the climate that we currently have in the Palouse will no longer exist anywhere, including the Palouse. And that's really depressing. But it kind of, indicates that we need to think about that when we're conducting restoration, especially at the scales needed on the Palouse. We need plants that can adapt. Maybe seed from areas that are drier or hotter, things along those lines. Public awareness is needed. There's not, I'm speaking to the choir on this one. And we need ways to expand prairie restoration beyond, these limited numbers of sites. So roadways, backyards. I mean, you drive through the Palouse and you say miles and miles of roadsides that don't have weed on them, but they don't have native plants either. So it would be really nice if those were restored into native plants to provide corridors for pollinators and birds and things like that. And CRP could also be modified to increase the diversity of the mixes they're using and use more forbs. So I'll close with, I don't think restoration, I just want to make sure it's clear. Restoration cannot replace preservation of our remaining prairie remnants, right? Because clearly we don't have a clue, right? Some people are better at this than others, and some organizations, but nevertheless, we have not managed to bring back the full suite of diversity of the Palouse Prairie. Only those remnant sites have that, if even they do, because they're not necessarily correct characteristic of the entire Palouse. But we can, I think, with restoration, make our ecoregion more functional and more resilient and better for pollinators. And, I think there's some potential there. There's a lot of potential. I'd like to start with acknowledging my students. This is a few of them. Eric Peterson's in the red sweater. Emma Hoskins, the pollinator network person, is in the middle. Christy Snyder was right next to her. Thurman, unfortunately, isn't in this picture. Sarah Hill did a lot of work looking at Palouse Prairie. She's in the blue jeans jacket. So they're all wonderful people, and their work, we've worked together on these projects to get information. And then also we have funders, and I'd like to acknowledge JC Jensen, who provided us with seed. BFI Native Seeds provided us with a lot of seed and a lot of advice. And Spokane Tribal Network, we've been working with Melody Wynn to think about what species to use. Latah County Conservation District, Brenda Earhart, Kurt Merg from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife are experts in Palouse Prairie restoration that we've leaned on. So, yeah, that's all. Any questions?
Oh, hold on a minute. Thank you so
One thing.
much. That I'm going to insert a quick little bit of information. This is Julie speaking. Thank you so much, Becky, for sharing your work with us. It's so insightful and interesting to see what you are doing in the Palouse, and it's inspiring too, this idea of getting our native plants to grow again and restore some of that terrain. Well, what we have at the end of the question and answer will be a message from Denise Mankey. She is the Executive Director of the Washington Native Plant Society. So we'd like to ask everyone to please remain with us through the Q&A. They're often very interesting. And hear our message from Denise. And thank you again, Becky. We'll go ahead and we'll get started on questions.
Okay.
Okay, we'll read them to you. Will that work?
Sure.
Okay. I would like to start with this first one from Rich. He says, I believe Northwest Meadowscapes sells Yampa for restoration, and it does. However, it's a different species than Becky mentioned for the Palouse. She mentioned the mountain Yampa, and I have in my hand a Northwest Meadowscape seed packet. It doesn't have the scientific name, but it says common Yampa. So I'm pretty sure this is our west side Yampa, and Becky's referring to a dry side Yampa. Just guessing, but seems likely.
Yeah, and even if it is the same species, because I wouldn't be surprised if it could be.
Okay.
Gardneri in Montana have the same one now, but because of name changing. But the ones in the west side aren't going to be adapted to the climate conditions in eastern Washington, and so yeah, we really need a seed source that's genetically appropriate for this region, even if it's the same species. And it's not here, but we're working on that. So.
All right, I will jump in with the next question. So this person says, I'm a bit confused by the terms module, hub, network, and connectors. So could you give a quick definition of those terms?
Sure. So a module is kind of like a grouping of species that tends, pollinators and plants that tend to interact a lot. So let's say you have yarrow, and this is totally made up, so don't, take this as the actual pollinators, but say you have yarrow and bee1, I'm a plant person, not a bee person, and you have, sticky geranium and bee2, and let's say they all cross, the pollinators go back and forth between both plants, and maybe there's 5 other plants that's similar. That's a module. And then there might be another module over here of different species, so maybe snowberry and I don't know, slender cinquefoil or whatever. So those are modules. A network is everything, all the modules and all the species. And so the hubs are the species that have the most connections, in modules. So the module hub has the most connection in a module. Network hub has connections across modules, across the whole, not the whole network, but across modules, and also has a lot of connections within modules. So it's a species that a lot of different pollinators are using. Potentially, if you're talking about plants, there can be network hub pollinators and network hub plants. So you have kind of both, and I focused on the plants for this talk. So hope that helps.
The next question asks, could you not seed with a low-cost, low-diversity seed, allow it to catch hold, then go in and install clusters of actual seedlings of the important, expensive plants and hope they spread?
I think that's a great idea. Yeah, thank you for that, because I think that's one of the things that we're exploring. And like I said, in the fall, we're seeding with a low-cost grass-only seed mix of like 6 species. And I'm hoping it doesn't turn out like those CRP sites that I showed you that have no forbs. In some cases, if the grasses get established too quickly, you would actually have to go in and remove some of them. And on a 120 acre scale, that's hard. But farmers are doing it at thousands of acre scales. So I think, if we could find a way to optimize the seed mix to get the best of both worlds, that would be great. But yeah, we're looking at approaches, we call them pollinator islands, of having like clusters of, different species planted here and there that might spread and attract pollinators. Didn't talk about that, but I'm glad you brought it up. And yes, we're gonna try that.
Okay, I'm going to jump over to the chat here. There are a couple questions there. So here's one that asks, is it possible to collaborate with landowners and farmers who are already planting native species?
Yes, I think it would be possible to do that. And we would like to do that. To an extent, we're already, because, for example, with Emma's project, looking at the plant pollinator networks, she did 3 reconstructed prairie sites from different farmers, and went out and surveyed the plant pollinator networks in those, in addition to looking at 3 sites that are remnant prairies, including some on private land, one near Medical Lake, for example. So yes, but we would love to do more. And like I said, a big goal of mine, and I think all of us, is to expand this beyond just 120 acres so that, and we're not the only organization that's trying to do this, but I think there's still a long, long road ahead of us. So the more collaboration, the better.
We can take turns back and forth. We have, could regular burns be used to remove competing invasives that may not have that ability?
I think that's a really interesting idea, and I think fire was a part of the prairie ecosystem. I think it's what kept the shrubs from dominating. So if you don't have fire for a long time on the north face of slopes, you'll start seeing more and more shrubs and trees coming in, more snowberries, pine trees even, you know. So fire was an important part of the ecosystem. That said, with these prairie remnants, you know, they're so small now that I think it's a high risk. And what some of our invasive species like cheatgrass love fire. They just come in roaring right in after fire. We've done research out at Turnbull that showed fire initially lowered the duff layer and helped the natives, but after 3 years, the ventonata was back stronger than ever, and especially where there was also animal disturbance like pocket gophers. And so I think our grasp of what's good disturbance and what's not in this era of climate change and heavy fragmentation is pretty weak. And so I think we have to be really careful.
Okay. I'm going to read the other question that's in the chat. So this person says, I'm from a group of students working to restore native plants on our college campus and college-owned lands in southeastern Washington. Do you have any advice for us to navigate convincing college admin on the importance of restoring native plants? And then she asks if you might have any resources about that, or ways to approach folks who don't hold the same values about the importance of restoration.
We have a fair amount of that surrounding us. But I think the reason that this happened on our campus was partly because they had the foresight to hire a sustainability coordinator, and most college campuses have one now. And then that's Eric Budsberg. And it was his vision that started this project of the idea of carbon sequestration. And so, and he had the ear of the administration because they really there's a big push for college campuses to, you know, balance their carbon a little better. So, so I think, you know, it's partly having the right people in place. And so if you have a sustainability coordinator, you know, based on my experience, I would talk to them, and because they probably have the ear of the administration. And then as far as the surrounding community, you're going to have both. We got a No Child Left Inside grant from Washington State, and we used that to get school kids from local schools to plant native plants, and that they then could come out and put in the Prairie Project. And then COVID hit and whatever. It didn't quite turn out exactly the way we thought it would, but still, you know, that was one way to kind of get in from the ground, right? Work with your school kids and your children, and, you know, and work with community groups like, you know, we have a Ren Pearson Community Center in Cheney and stuff like that. And you'll find that there's more people out there who support these kind of projects than you think. There's some naysayers for sure. When we wrote letters to private landowners to get access to land, we found a lot of naysayers, but got some real interesting letters. But, you know, I think there's a lot of people who will support you as well. And I think that's awesome what you're doing.
Ready for the next question? It is, what is the typical ratio of forbs to grasses in native prairie?
In native prairie?
That's the question.
I don't have that you know, I don't have that from like statistics and the numbers, but from having looked at a bunch of them, I would say, I mean, it depends on the site, but it was probably about, you know, 50-50, or you know, maybe even slightly more in favor of the forbs, you know, 60-40, 70-30. And so the reason that we're seeing these restoration mixes, starting with CRP, having more grasses, has a lot to do with cost and familiarity. There's been a lot of time and effort put into those native grasses and creating a seed that is reliable when you plant it in a field. And that hasn't been done with the forbs to the same degree. I think, if you're, yeah, I mean, yeah, I couldn't say exactly why, but that's where we're at.
All right. Our next question. What is it about topography that makes it such a significant effect? Maybe it's a proxy for soil moisture, sun and wind exposure, etc.
Yes, I think you're right. I think it's a proxy for soil temperature. We noticed, those south-facing aspects, they have more freeze thaw because it gets really cold at night and they freeze, but then they get the sun exposure and they thaw during the day, whereas the north facing is more stable. I have had a student who looked at a little bit at the soil microbiome and found that there's some differences in the soil microbiome, which I'm sure would be affected by heat and freeze thaw and drought. And so I think there's a lot going on with the temperature and but I do think it's an open question why we see more native species in our region on the north facing slopes. And that's a really interesting research question. So
it would be. Can you explain biochar a bit more?
So it's pyrolyzed organic matter. So what that means is they often take like the wheat straw and they, in this region, there's a lot of that, right? And then they burn it to create this charred material, like charcoal almost. And so pyro means burn, right? So it's burned organic material, but not burned to the point of nothing, still got some of that coal in there. And so that's then easy to transport, much like, smaller in comparison. And then they put that on the soil. There's been a lot of work with regenerative agriculture and soil development, looking at an interest in biochar because it does seem to benefit a lot of different plants. You can even buy it at the local garden store nowadays, probably, at least at ours you can. And so as a soil amendment. But I think in soils like we see on the Palouse where it's been tilled for 80 years, any organic matter that was in it has been decomposed and removed out to the atmosphere. The roots of the plants are tilled up every year so they don't stay in there. It's the idea, I guess, is to try and bring back some of that organic matter, some of that carbon.
All right. Next question. Is there any possibility of adding collaborators that deal with soil microbes?
Yes. And my colleague, Justin Bastow, I think he's hopefully on the list, yes, of acknowledgements. But yes, we're interested in more. We've talked to some folks at WSU Vancouver, like Tanya Cheek, who does work with mycorrhizae, and my colleague Justin Bastow does work with the soil food web, so looking at nematodes and other critters. And so we have been very interested in that because I think the plant soil feedbacks component is probably really important in these prairie systems. And we've really wrecked it with our tilling. And more the better, because there's just we don't have somebody who necessarily does like soil bacteria here at Eastern. But we do have, a lot of people who do microbiome work, but usually human or honeybee guts or things like that. But some of the approaches are similar.
Okay, next question. Have you looked into seeding low diversity grass dominant with smaller patches of high diversity forb dominant mixes on key sites? Are there optimal areas to plant higher diversity?
That's the question. So that we kind of talked about that a little bit in a previous question, but I'm interested in trying an approach called pollinator islands, and that some people call them forb islands, where you do just that, where you take some forbs and you try to put them in their optimal site, right? So find the spot where you think that plant would be happiest based on where they are out in the environment. And so, and then plant a cluster of them densely and see if that's enough to get them going, and spread from there, kind of create a little source metapopulation, if you will. But the data on that's pretty sparse. We've done a lot of literature review on that topic, and there's a lot of work to be done. So it's been done a little bit in the West with the BLM, but they had pretty inconclusive results. It's been done in the Midwest and it looked like it worked. So we need to try that. And I bet there's people out there doing it. They're just not like publishing their stuff. So right.
All right. This looks like our last question. How do you spread soil amendments over 120 acres? It's hard enough at garden scale.
This is a question for Ag Energy, or the person, they're the company that provided our biochar. Yes, I'm the wrong person to ask that question because I don't actually know how, but I'm assuming farmers have ways to spread soil amendments. So sprinkle it out. For us, the way we spread it on our 600-foot by 100-foot patches, we just got out rakes and lots of people, and we all got nice and dirty with black soot all over our faces. So, but
Okay.
harder at scale, yes. I'm sure machinery is available though. So.
Thank you for all the wonderful